Tennis is for everyone, and there are few limitations and restrictions on anyone from playing and enjoying the game of tennis. Tennis is also a good value for the dollar. Most of the clubs in Nova Scotia and the Maritimes have reasonable membership rates, which also usually include tennis instruction and court time. And if you wanted to play year-round, you could join an indoor facility like this one at Burnside Tennis Club. Tennis is also a game where only a very few essential pieces of equipment are necessary. A good tennis racket, a good pair of tennis shoes, and name-brand balls are all that you really need to start the game of tennis. Let's look at some of these essential pieces of equipment with Mike Radcliffe, the resident pro here at Burnside Tennis Club.
Okay, as far as equipment goes in tennis, you don't have to spend an awful lot of money to take the game up. Let's take a look here at comparison in shoes, for example. Here we have a shoe retailing for approximately $16. A very good canvas shoe, good solid sole on it for indoor or outdoor play. The advantage of using canvas, perhaps compared to leather, is that it breathes very well. If you do sweat somewhat in the foot, it absorbs the sweat. Leather has a tendency perhaps to dry up, even though it is a stronger material. Here are leather shoes in comparison. Again, you'll notice here that the higher arch on the back supports the ankle, very good for weak ankles, and also on the sole of the shoe here, a reinforced part on the ball of the foot which protects the shoe from becoming very worn and smooth. These are a much tougher and stronger shoe and retail for approximately $30. Another very important part of the footwear, of course, is the sock. Okay, here we see a half-length sock, good padded protection on the sole of it, and also good support for the ankle and calf muscles. Another point here is that some of you perhaps wear thinner socks. It pays to wear 2 pairs of socks if you're playing an awful lot of tennis and your shoes perhaps are slightly too big. You've got to make sure that there is no friction in between the foot and the shoe itself when you're running, because that is what causes the blisters. Moving on to another part of the equipment, which is the tennis ball. There are a number of brands on the market today. As we've seen perhaps on television quite often, the various colors. They manufacture tennis balls now not only in white but in optic yellow and also orange. These are again far better to see than the original white ball that they used to make only. The cheaper brand of ball perhaps is not as good as far as the cloth goes, so it pays to spend out $4 or $5 for a good can of tennis balls, which are going to last you a lot longer than perhaps a cheaper brand which you often see in some of the retail stores. The balls generally come packaged in a can of 3, and they're sealed, tested, which means that they're vacuum packed at the factory, and this is what keeps their pressure. There is also a pressureless ball which they use in Europe, which when you play with it is a little bit harder than the regular ball, and it will last longer because it has a far more bigger vacuum inside it, which doesn't tend to deflate as the regular ball. However, the ones on the market today that we see in North America, like the Wilsons, the Schlesinger, Dunlop, and the Bancroft, are all top-class balls and are worth investing in. Let's take a look now at perhaps the biggest part of your equipment when you're playing the game, and that is the racket itself. Today there are numerous rackets on the market made in 4 or 5 different materials. There is the original wood racket, the graphite that is now out. There is the aluminum and the steel. As far as the wood goes, when you're starting out, I would recommend that you use wood for the simple reason that you do get a lot more control perhaps on a wood racket. There is no substitute like wood for a material. Therefore, that when the ball hits anywhere really roughly in the center on the sweet spot, you get a very good, easy, vibrant feeling on it. The advantage of using the aluminum and steel rackets perhaps is the fact that you can hit the ball harder and faster, but when you're learning, I think control is the first thing, and then speed will eventually come. This one I have here in my hand is a lady's racket. The 2 points here to watch for are the size of the grip and the overall weight of the racket. This racket runs out at approximately 13.5 ounces, and the size of the grip would be about a 4 1/4. When you're measuring yourself for a racket, a useful indication to measure yourself for a racket as far as grip goes is that take the racket and shake hands with it. You'll notice that as I'm shaking hands here, my fingers do not join up with the palm of the hand, so I'm able to place my small finger in the middle. That would be a decent grip size to use. If the fingers were joining up, then you would find that the grip is too small and the racket would tend to slip in your hand, or it would cause severe elbow problems when you're hitting the ball because of the small grip and you're constantly gripping it too tightly. Another point for the juniors starting out, here we have a junior size racket. The difference here is in the length of it. It's approximately 1.5 inches shorter than the regular size one. This enables the junior who perhaps is just starting out, 8 or 9, 10 years old, to play with a lighter model, and again it's a wood frame which makes it fairly comfortable for him to get the feeling of the racket head when he's swinging through the ball. If he was to use a full-size one, even a lady's, he would find it a little bit on the big side. So don't be afraid to make sure that your local pro or the person in the sports shop where you go to goes through the checkpoints of the grip and the general size of the two rackets. There are other points to look for when purchasing a racket. One of the big points here is what it is strung with. There are two types of stringing. One is a natural string, which is what we define as gut, natural lamb or sheep gut, and then there is a synthetic, which is nylon. The advantage of nylon, being the cheaper of the two, is the fact that if you do play outdoors in damp conditions during the summertime, perhaps, the nylon will absorb any dampness, therefore the strings will not fray nearly as much as gut. Gut has a far better resilience, in other words, a much smoother feel to the ball when you hit it because you can string it more tighter than you can nylon, but there is the chance that if you do play in damper conditions it will get cut up in the center and tend to break a lot more easier than nylon will. There is quite a difference in price range. Good nylon can run out at say $15 for a restring compared to good top quality gut, which can run out at approximately $38. So when you're starting the game up, there's no reason why you shouldn't go into the nylon first, and then perhaps as you progress move on to gut. And for the junior rackets, most of them will come strung with nylon. The graphite racket is another new one on the market here. For example, it's what they call graphite reinforced. This is a material which is exceptionally strong, that they reinforce the area around the outside here, as you can see in black, which is the graphite. This supports the throat and gives the racket a far more strength around perhaps the weakest part, which is the throat. These are a little more expensive. They run out at about $80 for a racket, and they are a little more whippy in the sense that a little more flexible perhaps than the regular wood racket. A good strong racket, again, perhaps more for the advanced player than for the beginner. The other type of material that many of the rackets are made of today is, here we see the aluminum racket. This one, again, is all one piece right around from the handle to the head. This gives good solid support throughout. The one big advantage of the aluminum is the fact that the lightness of the material allows for less wear and tear on the elbow, plus there's less wind resistance when you swing through the open throat. This is a good point to watch for when you're starting out. If you do happen to be hitting the ball slightly off, this is going to absorb the impact and not give you so much problem with your elbow. So the aluminum racket is good, light, and it does have a slightly different feel to the natural wood one. It would be good to compare, if you ever had the opportunity at your local club or wherever, to try to hit with the aluminum and the wood and perhaps the steel before you condescend to buy one, just to understand the feeling of the 2 or 3 different types of materials, which are different. Finally, they're making today rackets which you may have seen. This one has a slightly larger head for those of you who may miss the ball completely once in a while. Again, this is quite legal to use it. It is the same length as the other ones, but you can see in comparison here that the head is perhaps a third or 2 larger than the regular size one. This racket can be used very effectively when you're playing the net on volley shots and also on the serve. It has a very large sweet spot, as you can see. Therefore, wherever the ball hits, you get a far better control from the wrist. That's one of the reasons why they started to manufacture it. For the beginner and for the players who like to play the net, it's an excellent frame, but you do have to get used to it. If you have been using a regular size racket and then switch to a larger size head, it takes you a while just to get the feel for the 2 different types. Any of the rackets that I've just shown you would be certainly good for all levels of play, but as I said before, you do not necessarily have to spend a lot of money first when you can purchase a good racket for perhaps $40 and a pair of shoes for $16 and a can of Wars. You can equip yourself for under $100 to start playing tennis.
Tennis is a game of motion and activity, and before you start any strenuous exercise, such as tennis, you should do some stretching exercises that prepare your body for the game. So we're going to do a few, and we're going to use the racket first, because you should be familiar with your own racket, and you should be using it as much as possible before you play the game, and of course when you're playing the game. So here's one that you can do to stretch the muscles of the arms and of the shoulders. Take the racket in one hand, put it in behind your back, and catch it with the other hand at the head, and just draw that racket down and stretch. Let it go back up, draw it down again and stretch, and you'll be stretching that arm muscle and that shoulder muscle. Of course, if you're left-handed, just take it in your left hand and do the same. And even if you don't use your left hand during play, it still will give you some balance in the stretching that you're doing for both sides of the body. There's also other stretching exercises you can do with the racket. You can place the racket out to your right and place your left hand out extended as well. And take that racket and put it where your left hand is by rotating the shoulders and the feet at the same time. And this is a very, very normal motion in tennis, and one that gives you that stretching of the shoulders and rotation of the trunk. Now, some other exercises that you can do where you don't need the racket. You can place your feet about shoulder width apart, dropping the upper part of the body forward, and just gradually bending and stretching until you can come down and touch the floor. And you'll find some tension in behind the calf muscles and in the hamstring area behind your thighs. If you do feel some tension, that's good. That means that the exercise is working. But don't stretch so much that it causes pain or discomfort. For leg muscles, again, taking one foot and extending it out forward and that one foot planted behind you, perpendicular to that foot. You can bend that forward knee and put lots and lots of weight and pressure on that hind leg, stretching especially the inside muscles, and of course some on the outside of the leg. And again, make sure you do a little for each side so you get some balance in your stretching. Pushing forward again, and the pressure back on this hind leg. Now, there's other stretching exercises that you can do. There's one for the neck, because there is a lot of activity with the neck and the shoulders during the play. And just rest the head back along the shoulder and rotate it around. Like so. That stretches the muscles in and around the neck and allow you to have a little more flexibility of the neck and shoulders while you're playing. Then you can take some tennis balls, and you can do this at any time during the day. Don't have to do it necessarily before you play, but you could put tennis balls in your hands and squeeze those tennis balls to develop strength, especially in the wrist and the forearm parts of the body. And those are the parts of the arm that you use most of all when you're striking the tennis ball. Now, those are just some of the stretching exercises that you should do before you even hit the first tennis ball during actual play. Let's talk now about grip, stance, and ready position. First of all, the grip. To assume a proper grip, and assuming that you're a right-handed player, take the racket in your left hand with 2 fingers and the thumb, like so, and take your right hand and place it in the middle of the strings of the racket, and draw that hand slowly down the throat till you get to the base or the butt of the racket. Then grip the racket as if you're shaking hands with it. Now, the fingers should be comfortably spread, and that index finger should be up on the handle slightly. Now, notice that there is some space between the bottom 2 fingers and the middle finger, and that the thumb rests comfortably on top of the middle finger. That is what we call an Eastern forehand grip, and that's a grip we recommend that all new young players use when they're starting out in tennis. We recommend it because you'll notice that when you hold the racket out to approximately where you're going to be striking the ball, the racket face is square to the hitting area. It's not open and it's not closed, it's square to the hitting area. This allows you to control better the flight of the ball as it goes over the net. We don't want it to go so high that it goes outside the court, and we don't want it to go so low that it goes into the net. So an Eastern forehand grip has the racket square to the hitting area upon contact. Now, of course, you could use other grips. You could use a continental grip or a Western grip, but those are grips for more advanced players. The Eastern forehand grip is the one we recommend for all beginning players. We're going to talk in future about the Eastern backhand grip when we talk specifically about the backhand stroke. Now that we looked at the grip, let's talk about the stance. The stance is important because from the stance we get the balance that we need to go and retrieve the ball no matter where it's hit. In order to have a proper stance, we should first of all spread our legs about shoulder width apart and make sure the weight is slightly forward. Bend the knees, but try to make sure that the back is kept relatively straight. Now let's take a side view of that so you get the idea of having the weight slightly forward. We get up on what is called the balls of the feet, and the heels are just slightly touching the surface. The knees are slightly bent, and I feel balance by keeping my back relatively straight. We don't want to pitch our back forward and have so much weight that we're off balance. We want to feel that we do have balance so that I can go forward, I can go back, I can go to my left, I can go to my right, depending on where the ball is hit. That basically is the stance, and it should be comfortable for you. Some of these things may differ. You may want to put your legs further apart, a little closer together, but try to make sure that you have balance so that you can retrieve the ball. Now that we've talked about stance, we're ready to put those 2 aspects of grip and stance together for the ready position. And the ready position is the position you assume prior to any striking of the ball. Take that racket in the left hand, again with those 2 fingers and the thumb, and hold the racket in the forehand grip, but not hard on the handle, just light on the handle. Make sure again that the feet are about shoulder width apart, the weight is slightly forward and the knees are bent, and the back is relatively straight. That is the ready position. After every time that you strike the ball, you should assume again the ready position. So there's three other elements of the game that we should know: the grip, the stance, and the ready position. You'll have more fun, you'll get more exercise, and more enjoyment out of the game of tennis if you develop a smooth, comfortable, and consistent swing. Perhaps the most used swing in tennis is the forehand stroke. Now, before we get into the elements of the forehand stroke, let's assume that the net is out in front of us, and that the sidelines are out to the sides, and that my backstop is out behind me. Now, before we talk about the four elements of the forehand, let's make sure that we're in the ready position, because this is the position that we assume before any stroke. So we have our feet comfortably spaced. We have the racket out in front of us held in the left hand with those three fingers, and we have a forehand grip. Now the first part of the swing is called the back swing. We'll refer to that as turn and racket back. The second part of the swing is the approach, and we'll call that the step. The third part of the swing is called the hit, and we'll refer to that as the swing. And the last and final part of the forehand stroke is the follow through. Now each part in itself is important, but you must remember that they're all together part of one smooth, consistent, and comfortable swing. So the first part, turn and racket back. Now as the ball approaches you on the forehand side, turn your shoulders, your feet, and the racket all in one motion until you get your feet perpendicular to the sideline. And when you get to that position, drop that left hand and push that racket out behind you. Now your shoulders are perpendicular to the net, my toes are pointing out toward the sideline, and the racket is behind me pointing to my backstop. Now let's look at some guidelines for proper position in the backswing. Notice that my hand is approximately at my waist, and that the weight is more on the front or right foot, and that the ball of the left foot gives me balance. So now we have the first part of the forehand swing, the turn, and the racket back. Now from here we go next to the approach or the step part of the forehand swing. And simply, when the ball now gets within range, you take the left or the back foot in this case and step directly out toward the net. That transfers the weight forward and now again gives you balance, and you're still in proper position to make a good swing and hit on the ball. That next step, the swing, is where you bring the racket forward and you strike the ball. Let's go back now to the ready position and review those first two elements of the forehand swing. The ball is approaching us on the forehand side. We turn very quickly, our shoulders and our feet, pushing that racket out behind us, and take that approach step out toward the net. Now, as you take that approach step, the swing follows through. There should be very little pause in between the step and the swing. And it's almost a sequence. Step, swing, step, swing. So now that we've stepped, let's bring the racket through to approximately out in front of our body, making sure that the racket head is square and that we're watching the point of contact. Very important for young players and for advanced players to make sure they watch the ball as it makes contact with the racket. Now that is the hit. The next part of the swing continues from there and is called the follow-through. So, when we turn, get the racket back, step, swing and make contact, we allow the racket to come through out in front of us and be raised slightly to the head and now point to our opponent's backstop. Now those elements are the four elements that complete the forehand swing. But again, you must remember that all four elements make one consistent swing. Turn, push the racket back, step forward and transfer the weight, swing, and follow through. Lack of or too much of a follow through are both hazards to avoid. If you don't follow through completely, you'll end up punching the ball, which will not allow you to give consistent long shots. And if you overswing during your follow through, it will take you off balance and not allow you to get back to the ready position to hit the next shot. Because in the forehand stroke, the palm of the hand controls the racket throughout the swing, let's look specifically at what happens to the hand during the forehand swing. In the ready position, the palm of the hand is facing out toward the sideline. And as you turn your shoulders and draw the racket back and push it out behind you, the wrist is slightly laid back. Laying back the wrist means extending the fingers more behind you so that there's slight pressure on the wrist. That gets the racket in the proper position so that when the racket is swung through, the racket face is square to the hitting area. Notice now when we are preparing to strike the ball that the palm of the hand is facing out toward the net. Now as we complete our hit sequence and get to our follow through, the palm of the hand is again back where it started, facing out toward the sideline. Let's go and hit some balls on the forehand side and see the swing in operation. Remember, when we go and hit the forehand, we want to try to hit the ball about 4 feet over the net so that we get good depth in our shots. So we're in the ready position. We have the racket out in front of us, and when the balls come to the forehand side, we turn, get the racket back, step and swing. Turn, get the racket back, step and swing. Turn, get the racket back, step and swing. Notice it's a smooth, consistent swing. You don't have to overswing or hit the ball extremely hard. Let the racket do the work. Use your body and the transfer of weight to give you the power necessary. Try to focus down on the ball, concentrate on the point of contact, and don't overswing. Swing smoothly through each time. You can use this left hand to catch the racket so that it doesn't progress too far away from the opponent's backstop. Weight comes forward, there's balance, and it's a smooth, consistent, comfortable swing. And that's the forehand stroke. The backhand is the other ground stroke that we'll be talking about. And in order to hit the backhand, we have to assume a different grip. So let's start first in the ready position and cradling the racket in the left hand with those 3 fingers. Assume the Eastern forehand grip as we did before. Now that you have the Eastern forehand grip, turn that racket 1/4 turn toward the palm of your hand and grip the racket. Now the knuckle of the first finger should be approximately on the edge or the top of the racket. That is the Eastern backhand grip, and that's the grip that you need for using the backhand stroke. Now I'll just show you by standing sideways that just as in the Eastern forehand the racket was square to the hitting area, in the Eastern backhand the racket is also square to the hitting area when we meet the ball correctly out in front of our body. And that's the reason why you need that different grip. When you start practicing your backhand swing, assume the Eastern backhand grip, but you'll have to, as a competitive player, learn to adjust your grip during the actual play of the game. Now the elements of the backhand are very similar to the elements of the forehand. We have the racket back, we have the approach step, we have the hit itself, and the follow through. So the stroke itself is not much different. Many players, though, have difficulty with the backhand because they feel uncomfortable swinging the racket across their body. If you can think of throwing a frisbee as you normally would playing with friends, it's a motion similar to swinging a backhand stroke. And if you think about opening doors with your right hand and pushing it through, that's also a motion that's very similar to the swing involved in the backhand. The backhand actually can be the easier stroke. And if you do the elements in sequence as we are going to do them, you will see it'll become as effective as the forehand swing. So let's start. First of all, in the ready position and with the backhand grip. Now we're going to pull that racket and turn our feet and shoulders and bring that racket so it's again facing the backstop behind us, because we're assuming that the net is out in front and the sidelines are out to the sides. Now we've completed actually the turn and racket back position. If you need a guideline, try to get the butt end of the racket pointing out toward the net. That will show you that you have the racket head in proper position. And try to get the thumb of the racket hand almost in your pocket. Now the racket's in proper position and we're ready to do the next sequence in the swing, and that's the approach step. It's similar to the approach step on the forehand. You take the rear foot, you step out toward the net directly and transfer the weight from the back foot to the front foot. Now let's just look at that again as 2 pieces of the backswing. Ready position, pull the racket back, get your hand in close to your waist, almost in your pocket. You have your feet and your shoulders turn. Your shoulders are almost perpendicular to the net, and a proper shoulder turn will ensure you have a proper swing. Step out toward the net and transfer the weight. Now we're ready to bring the racket through and strike the ball. Again, the racket face is square because we've attempted to strike the ball out in front of our body and to the left, and the racket is about waist level. So now that we've struck the ball, we have the last element of the backswing, and that's the follow-through. Allow the racket to go through with the weight, and then carry the racket up high, about head height, and make sure you have a complete follow through at the end of your swing. Weight will be now coming forward, but you'll be balanced. The left foot or the hind foot, just as in the forehand, should be on the ground to give your body balance, and you should be ready to step back to the ready position for the next stroke. Now that's very much the backhand swing in total. And let's review it as one piece one more time. Pull the racket back, hand in close, step out toward the net, transfer the weight on the hit and the follow through, ending up nice and high, balanced, and back to the ready position. Let's hit some balls now on the backhand and see what happens during actual stroke play. During the backhand, try to make sure that you get a good shoulder turn, pointed out toward the net, and get your feet close together so that you can adjust in relationship to where the ball bounces. Keep your eye on the ball, on contact. Try to focus down on the ball so that you can see it hit the racket strings. And make sure that you follow through nice and high, but not over swinging on the ball. Let the racket do the work for you. Turn the feet, step, swing, follow through. Turn the feet, step, swing, follow through. And that's the backhand. Now that we've seen both the forehand ground stroke and the backhand ground stroke, let's look at some of the do's and don'ts in relationship to those strokes. Many players during the forehand and the backhand will turn but step directly out toward the net. Or when the ball comes to them, they won't turn and step directly out towards the net. You must make sure that you turn your shoulders and your feet and get the racket out behind you before you make that approach step. If you don't turn your feet and shoulders, there's the problem of having the ball struck directly close to you and not being able to adjust. Also on the forehand, we mentioned the problem of not enough backswing or not enough follow through, and also too much follow through. So we don't want to take the racket only to the side. We want to make sure that we turn and get the racket all the way back to assure us of a full, comfortable, and smooth swing. On the follow through, we've already mentioned that many players punch the ball and don't get consistency on their hits, or they follow through so much that it takes them off balance. Many times we see professional players striking the ball with great intensity and great motion. Well, they are professional players, and only the very best players can alter their strokes and adapt their strokes during play. As beginners and intermediate players, we should try to do the basic swing as we have outlined it. In the backhand, one of the most serious problems is leading with the elbow. This does not allow the racket to come through, leaves the face of the racket open and usually lower than the hand and the waist, causing the ball to go especially off extremely to the left, not allowing us to hit a solid ground stroke and also hit cross court. If you're having problems striking the ball efficiently and effectively on the backhand, you might want to try a two-handed backhand. All you do is when you're drawing the racket back and turning your shoulders and feet, take that left hand and drop it down along the handle, assuming a baseball grip. And when you step through, you will find that it's a natural shoulder turn and follow through that you get with a two-handed backhand. Many of the best players in the world today use a two-handed backhand, especially if they're playing from the baseline, because they get effective, efficient strokes every time. Those are then some of the do's and don'ts for the forehand and the backhand ground strokes.
Mr. Morrison, it's very pleasant sitting out here in the park at St. Peter's with the village spread out behind us here. I guess it's changed quite a bit since you were a boy. You were born in 1887?
That's correct.
That was the year of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee.
Yes.
Do you remember much from back those times?
No. 87, I didn't remember anything about that time.
Well, no, but I mean a few years after that, when you were a boy growing up in St. Peter's.
Oh, yes. Well, I'd remember some things after perhaps 5 or 6, when I'd be 5 or 6 years old.
How large was the town then?
Well, I think perhaps it might about perhaps half the size it is now.
So it has grown over the years?
Yes, it has, but not a great deal. More on the outskirts than in the village.
Now, your father started the store, Morrison's store, here in St. Peter's. Did you go to work with him fairly early?
Yeah, I went to work with him when I was 16, and I've been working ever since.
And you were at school, I suppose, till you were 16, were you?
Yes, yes.
And you're still running the store today?
Yes, running as much as I can.
When was the store opened?
1881.
1881.
Yes.
That's nearly 100 years then.
2 years short.
Morrison's store, still with the founder's initials on the door. It's a landmark in St. Peter's. People all around know that if you can't get what you want at Morrison's, you can't get it this side of Halifax. Summer visitors to the Brador know it too, and the boat owners who traverse the St. Peter's Canal. That's another St. Peter's landmark, important at the time of Confederation and long after for its commercial traffic, still important today for touring sailors making their way from open Atlantic into the Brador Lakes. There's a sense of history here, older than the earliest recorded visits of the white man to the area, when only Micmacs knew this land. It was history made by 15th century Portuguese fishermen, French explorers of the 1600s, and the Johnny-come-lately English in the 18th century. That history is told in the Nicola Denny Museum, overlooking St. Peter's Canal. Kay Robertson.
And we consider him the founder of our village, along with a lot of other trading posts that he had in the whole area along the St. Lawrence, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and up as far as the Gaspé. And 1650 is the date that we use, but really we know he was here earlier than that, probably around 1632.
How do you know that?
Because he joined an expedition to North America, to this area in particular, with a friend of his who was in charge of the expedition, and there are records of that. They were engaged in settling and fishing and various industries in the whole area.
So he passed through here earlier, 1632.
Yes.
But he didn't establish anything here
Well,
until...
we don't know exactly when, but at least by 1650 he had established a trading post here and one in St. Anne's, also in Cape Breton.
It seemed like wherever he stopped, he built a fort.
Yes, although I don't think he was too concerned about the natives or the English, most of his problems were with people from his own country, who he had several very bad experiences with people who tried to take over his rights, who captured them at more than one time, and he had to go back to France and get his rights settled again. He had a lot of problems with, as I said, his native French.
What exactly was he trying to do? Was he trying to make a connection with the Micmac Indians in the area for trading for furs, or?
His chief interest was the fisheries, and he was trading in furs. He also had, he was interested in agriculture. He planted grain, fruit trees, but fisheries in particular, and he spent a lot of time in developing better methods for the cod fishery in this area.
So did he encourage settlers to come out here?
Yes, it was part of his the rights that he had would include bringing settlers. In that way, he wasn't very successful. He was rather disappointed about that, according to his book.
What was the population of the area at the time that he was best established here?
Well, there might have been 200 or 300 people.
Well, that doesn't sound,
No.
for those times, as
No,
if he'd been
no.
very much of a failure, actually.
No, but to actually have them settle down and live here, he was disappointed about that. Finally, what finally moved him away from St. Peter's when all his buildings were burned at one time, and he moved back to Bathurst then,
So he went up into what is now New Brunswick.
in the Bathurst area.
But that, of course, was part of Acadia at that time, wasn't
Oh
it?
yes, he had a post there too. Yes, that was one of his big posts.
Well, how much country, then, was he governing at the time?
Well, he had the whole coast of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, including Prince Edward Island, and up as far as the Gas Bay, and all the coast of New Brunswick, and the eastern part of Nova Scotia.
I'm sitting here with this book in my lap. It's a description of the coast of North America written almost in diary form by Nicola Denny. And I
Yes.
suppose this is an invaluable source of research material for you.
It is. He actually he didn't write as a diary. He wrote it after he retired to Bathurst. He wrote it and had it published in France. For a long time, it was out of print. About a few years ago, Greenwood Press reprinted it, so we have a copy. And the translation was done by Professor Ganong. And he has an interesting foreword there that describes a lot of his opinion of Denny and Denny's type of writing and so on. But he wrote, it was supposed to be a description really of the coast of this part of North America. And so it is. A lot of it contains his own problems too. And he was very interested in the Indians. He has several chapters. He appreciated their culture, was interested in all their customs, and he really had a very broad outlook as far as the Indians were concerned.
Sounds like a much more enlightened man than the usual sort of person who
Yes.
came to this country in those times.
Yes, all the references to him speak of him as being a very highly intelligent, broad-minded man who was interested in the general area, not just in making money. He wasn't a mercenary man at all.
Well, I guess looking back over all those years, it's rather fortunate that St. Peter's had such a person to start it off on its way.
Yes, he did make a start here. Part of the reason, I suppose, for being here was because of the isthmus that made it possible to take ships across from the St. Peter's Bay and the Atlantic to the Redora Lakes. He himself had a haul-over system to take ships across the isthmus.
After Denny's time, who were the next people to come in here?
Well, there was quite a long period then after he left and went back to Bathurst. Then the French built Fort Toulouse, which was a backup fortress to Louisbourg. And that was quite a settlement there. Fort Toulouse was in charge of quite a large area around here, in charge of the defense of a number of French settlements.
They didn't take over the the old Denny Fort.
No.
So they
but
built
that
a-
was between 25 and 50 years when he left, from the time he left until the French settled here again.
Well, can you give me a bit more information about that period? It seems like it might be an interesting thing. If you,
The-
as
the
you
Fort-
say, it was a
the Fort
backup to,
Toulouse?
yes, backup to Fort
Um,
Louisbourg.
Yes. They even built a road connecting Fort Toulouse with Louisbourg. It was built by Count de Raymond, who was one of the illegitimate sons of King Louis XIV. And he spent so much money on this road that he was called back to France in disgrace. And besides, in Louisbourg, they realized that this might be an opportunity for the British to attack them from land.
A road can serve more than one
Yeah.
master, eh?
Yes, yes. So it must have been quite an enterprise at that time. It was very expensive. So we still have, there still are traces of the road here and there between St. Peter's and Louisbourg, where people refer to the old French road.
So the road was actually completed all the
Oh,
way?
yes, oh, yes.
Well, it would be a more convenient method, I suppose, of transporting men and materials between the two places. There was a
Yeah.
fairly close connection then between Fort Toulouse and Louisbourg?
Yes, it was considered it was a backup fortress, and there are plans for enlarging it. Actually, it was when the British under Pepperell attacked Louisbourg, they came in here first and sank some ships.
That was the New England expedition.
Yes, the New England
in,
expedition,
what was it,
right.
1745, I think.
And then it was apparently attacked again the second time and destroyed.
When Louisbourg fell, the French Fort Toulouse was abandoned and the colony was taken over by the English. In proper military style, they took the high ground and built their fort at the top of Mount Granville. It provided excellent visibility out to sea and into the Bredor Lakes behind them. The canal was only a dream then. This was merely a carrying place, a short, difficult portage for heavy vessels along a track that hadn't changed much from Nicola Denny's day. In the Denny Museum, there's an aerial photograph of St. Peter's where you can pick out the historical highlights of the area. Nicola Denny's original fort, the site of Fort Toulouse, and the British Fort Granville. And you get some idea of its strategic location between Atlantic Ocean and inland lakes. More about St. Peter's and its canal after these messages. Nicola Denny built the first road to haul ships across the isthmus. It's hard to imagine today how those ox teams could manage with some of the larger trading vessels that wanted passage. But even then, there were references written about the desirability of a proper canal to take the increasing traffic. It was a dream that was only finally realized in the second half of the 19th century. But it finally introduced the heyday of St. Peter's. To learn more, we talked to Canal Superintendent John Auld. John, standing here in front of St. Peter's Canal, it looks a fairly modern piece of work, the part we see, but that, of course, has been reconditioned in the last little while. Let's go back in history, though. Who originally had the idea to put a canal through from the Atlantic to the Bredor Lakes?
Well, our records show that the local inhabitants were, 10, 20 miles from both sides here. Before Confederation, they traveled back and forth with petitions signed by fishermen and boat owners in the area asking for a canal. It was first surveyed in 1825, and after construction started, several times the contractor went broke. It was finally completed in 1869.
2 years after Confederation.
2 years after Confederation. So you can see that the then provincial government was in charge of it, supplied the money and so forth, money plans and so forth. But in 1867, well, then the federal government took over the responsibility, then known as the Department of Railways and Canals.
Was there a fair amount of commerce for the St. Peter's Canal at that time?
Well, you have to remember that before the days of your superhighways and railroads, that consumer goods depended almost wholly on boat from port to port. For instance, the merchants here would import all their wares in from suppliers in Halifax by boat.
And it was the easy route to Sydney, I guess. The Sydney is both of
Surely,
them.
as the mines and steel plant developed down there, St. Peter's Canal. Records show that some ships, some years, would be as many as over 1,000 ships. 1,300 ships passed through St. Peter's Canal.
Any idea of the value of that commerce at that time?
No, I wouldn't. If you want to talk value, it also shows in the records that the canal dwelling up here was completed in 1876. It was $800 allotted for the construction. The contractor used $565. What was a man-hour worth in those days?
It certainly wasn't very much.
Yeah.
You couldn't get much of a house today for $800.
No, it wouldn't supply a coat of paint for the house now. Yeah.
You said the canal was completed in 1869, but that wasn't this canal, was it?
It was little more than a ditch, 26 feet wide. It was deepened and enlarged again in the 1872 to 1876 period, and again in 1912-1917 period. That was quite an amazing feat. This west wall here, they put it in the dry between 1912 and 1915 and kept the canal operational. The first lock was way out here on the east bank. In fact, that east wall that you see out here at the far end is covered with cement now, but you can, underneath the broken cement, you can see the original wall that was put there prior to 1869.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1915, they put earth dikes across at both ends, completed this lock in where it is now, and put new walls as you see them today.
So this is what we call the new St. Peter's Canal.
That's right, from the 1912-1917 period.
What's the largest vessel that can go through the canal?
265 feet long, draft of 16 feet, and width of 45 feet.
So that's a fair-sized vessel.
That is a fair-sized vessel. It will take it was built to handle the upper seaway ships of that time, before the seaway was built, really, the Cornwall Canal system.
I don't suppose you get too many that size these days.
Very rarely, very rarely. There hasn't been any more than a half a dozen neat fits, something I'd need a shoehorn to get into the locks since I've been here, 16 years.
You speak of the locks, and they seem as a rather strange construction compared to most of the canals that I've seen. This double gate system that you have on them.
Well, that is purely because of the Atlantic tide on the south end of the canal raises up to 8 feet in the full moon period, rise and fall, and the Bredor Lake is more or less constant at half Atlantic level. Now, with that quick explanation, you can see that when the Atlantic tide is down, we have a 4-foot head on the Atlantic end. When the Atlantic tide is up, we have a 4-foot head at the opposite end.
So there's very little tide at all in the Bredor Lakes?
More or less constant. Now, we know that we have a natural exit out through Grand Narrows and Patrick's Channel and Big Bredor. When the tide on the east side of Cape Breton is down, sure, the water rushes out under the Seal Island Bridge through the current up to 12 knots. But when you consider the total cubic volume of the Bredor Lake and that you get 2 tide changes a day, 2 highs and 2 lows, so little water gets in or gets out that it doesn't materially affect the level on this side of the lake.
Just can't get all of that water through the gap.
No. The only variation we get in the Bredor Lake area here is because of wind. You take westerly wind, the day or two of that, and we'll be down 6 or 8 inches here. Conversely, we get easterly wind for a day or more, it'll be 6, 8 inches higher here.
Mm-hmm. But this double gate system will take account of any of those variations.
Oh, yes, that's why we have the diamond gates at each end, double set of gates.
What sort of traffic do you get through the canal now?
It averages out about 80% pleasure craft, 15% commercial craft, and 5% government craft.
Mm-hmm. What sort of commercial craft are you talking about? Fishing boats?
Inshore fishermen, mostly. See, now with the 200-mile limit on, I venture to say that inside of 10 years, you'll see many more of our inhabitants engaged in fishing, because there is good money in it, and where it was totally exhausted, now it's starting to come back again.
So you're looking forward to an increase then in commercial traffic through the canal?
Increase in commercial traffic and in pleasure craft. As we become more affluent, a pleasure boat seems to be a status symbol, where a few short years ago the automobile was a status symbol.
Are there tolls on the canal still?
No, tolls were instituted on secondary canals 4 years ago, but I was able to prove to the satisfaction of my superiors that with our low traffic volume here, it would be a losing proposition, that we'd spend more in collecting tolls than we would gain.
Do you have any idea how many vessels go through in a full season?
I anticipated that question, Bill. Now, this year we've got 171 through to date. In 78, our total was 498. In 77, 404. 76 was 420. 75, 512. 74, 581. 73, 506. And 72, 404.
It sounds generally, though, as if the volume is decreasing.
Yes, it has gone back a little bit in the last couple of years, but there again, I tell you, that's because the inshore fishing been at a low ebb.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you're expecting, as we've already mentioned, that will increase.
Yeah.
The canal, is it open all year round?
Oh, no. Oh, no. No, we ice up on the Bredor Lake side anytime after mid-December, and we get break up roughly around mid-April. I'll give me leeway of a week or two either way with weather, you know, so navigation is impossible after that time. Now, Ottawa, the powers that be lay down our navigation season. It's standard for all secondary canals, which runs from about mid-May to mid-October, a day or so variation. But after ice break up till the official opening of navigation in mid-May, and from following the official close of navigation in mid-October until we get a freeze-up, navigation is at my discretion, and we will accept craft from Monday to Saturday from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. And we prefer 12 hours advance notice because my staff are all on compensatory leave and I have to get them back to work.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting in our outer walls are getting in a bad state of repair. Due to the tight money policy now, further work is deferred until tentatively set at the winter of 81-82. A 5-year plan had been evolved after much study, which called for restoring the lock to its present state as you see it right now. The winter of 1976-77, cofferdams were installed, the lock dried out, and the walls completed. 1977-78 winter, dried out again, and we put in new floor in the lock, the steel gates, the electro-hydraulic power, and restored the bridge, took out deteriorated members, and installed electro-hydraulic power over there too.
One of the first English settlers at St. Peter's was Lawrence Kavanagh, who established his homestead some years before the first Scots came to settle in Cape Breton. Because of his experience of the conditions, he was a tremendous help to the new settlers when they did arrive. But he is remembered today for something far more important, a reminder of religious intolerance in Nova Scotia when Roman Catholics were not free to worship openly in their own way, and when a Roman Catholic was barred from holding public office. Harvey McEwen recalls what happened.
Yes, well, of course, he was the first Roman Catholic to sit in the House of Assembly in the whole British Empire. This is the significant point about Lawrence Kavanagh, I think, in history.
So it was really a breakthrough as far as religious intolerance was concerned.
It was a breakthrough, yes, definitely, right.
Now, I notice in the plaque here, it says that he was elected as a member in 1820, but he didn't take his seat until 1823.
Mm-hmm.
Why was that?
Well, in 1820, he more or less, it was the interim, I guess, till the official permission was given, where he didn't have to obey the oath. So he, in that interim, he was actually representing the whole island of Cape Breton. I don't know in what manner. Actually, I suppose it wouldn't be really official, you know. But, of course, in 1823, it was made actually official that he would sit in the House of Assembly.
There is so much more in the Nicola Denny Museum that we simply haven't the time to discuss. The artifacts of early settlers, a detailed photographic history of the building of the canal and its various modernizations, the ships that sailed out of this odd old port. But they'll still be there when you find time to stop in St. Peter's and take a close look at this historic ground. We'll be back next week. Join us for Heritage.
Wherever the pipes play across the world, men and women of Scottish race will be there to hear their music. From Highland Glen and Island Sheeling, from lowland plains and border hills, this people has gone forth to find homes in other lands. Canada in particular has given sanctuary to many thousands of Scots. Proud spirit has left its mark upon each of her 9 provinces. In the highlands of Cape Breton, Scottish settlers found scenes that recalled to them their own beloved homeland. There is an old Gaelic saying which translated runs, "A Gael's breathing place is on the summit." Crafts and cottages were set high on the hills and far apart, for a deep enjoyment of solitude is as vital a part of Scottish character as is generous hospitality and friendship.
Well, that's including.
The Reverend Norman MacLeod was the founder of one of the most distinctively Gaelic settlements in Nova Scotia. In 1817, he led a large band of followers westwards to the New World. Back in Scotland, MacLeod had seen the people go hungry and hopeless. He had disagreed also with what he considered the reactionary spirit of the church. Following 3 hard years on the mainland, the immigrants once more set sail in a vessel well named the Ark and built by themselves. It was intended that their voyage should take them eventually to Ohio. A storm, however, drove them from their course, and after many days battling against the elements, the ship was finally forced to take shelter in St. Anne's Harbour on the west coast of Cape Breton. The only Gaelic college in the world now stands near to the place where the first immigrants landed. Founded in 1939, it aims at keeping alive the culture and crafts so dear to Highlanders and Lowlanders alike. Education has always been highly prized by the Scots, and a school was the first building they erected. This great reverence for learning persists down to the present day. The older people never returned to the land of their birth, but set their roots deep into the soil of freedom to which they believed Providence had guided them. Today, living among the lonely farms, are many who have heard their grandparents tell of adventures experienced by the early settlers, as well as of the daring exploits of other Scots in Canada. The wild skirl of the pipes, as it drifts across the hills, recalls to them tales of Highland regiments who landed with Wolfe at Quebec, stories of explorers like Simon Fraser and Alexander Mackenzie, whose discoveries charted a highway across the continent, and the romantic record of Scottish merchants who did so much to make Montreal the great commercial capital of the Dominion. Until the first church was built, communion services were held out of doors. Soon, however, church spires rose among the hills, symbols of a dearly won freedom to worship God as they deemed best. The churches became the center of a vigorous, if plain, form of worship.
Agus maigún fíochan evel mar a bhaithas singe to a look fío. Agus na leik dan an boerig sein, ach suur sein jou nog. Or is left to riach, agus an kwach, agus a glód gesiering. Amen. Dus nie sein je gewoon kloon hierne, voor een trief salam harish ernike. Is a kier feen a spoorge jong, havimi an yi.
Presenters led the singing of the metrical version of the psalms, the custom being for the congregation to repeat each line after him, a practice which grew out of the illiteracy of some and the dearth of hymn books of the time. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. As in Scotland, so now in New Scotland, sheep farming became an integral part of the crofter's life, and hundreds of small flocks wandered freely over the hills. Oh, bid them never tie them mair, wi' wicked strings of hemp or hair, but caw them out to park or hill, and let them wander at their will. So may his flock increase and grow to scores o' lambs and packs o' wool. And may they never learn the gates of either vile wan restful pets, to slink through slaps and reeve and steal, of stacks of peas or stalks of kale. So may they, like their great forebears, for many a year come through the shears. So wives will gie them bits of bread, and bairns greet for them when they're dead. The fleece from each year's shearing requires to be carefully washed before being spun into yarn. For this the women bring kettles and tubs to the banks of a stream, where there will be plenty of water for rinsing. The wool must be spun and woven into cloth, and then there still remains the milling. For this, neighbours gather round the rough table of planks, and as they pass the damp cloth from hand to hand, thumping it on the boards to shrink and soften it, the traditional milling songs are sung. With their folklore, the Gaelic people have brought to Canada the finest traditions of the Scottish clans. Their strength and valour, rectitude and godliness, warm hearts and wise heads have all helped to build well our great dominion.
Shochet, soch, mar,